What does the number 8, Sarah Garnet, Botanical Gardens, and Mills have in common? Heilige Strozak, another episode of the Gilded Age. Hey everyone, this is D, Movieman, fellow cinephile, popcorn addicts, and emerging film critic, coming to you with reliable recaps, reviews, and reactions. And once again, I'm coming to you all with another episode of the Gilded Age, Season 2, Episode 6, Warning Shots. This episode is directed by Crystal Roberson, who is a writer, director, and producer. She's doubled as director and producer for the series Greenleaf and Queens, and she's also directed for the series American Soul, All-American, and BMF. She'll also be directing for the upcoming 4th season of Genius, following the lives of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. This episode was also written by Julian Fellows. So we open up this episode seeing Bill Henderson addressing the strikers as they chant 888. That's 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, and 8 hours for what you will. And as was anticipated in the last episode, they will be bringing weapons of their own despite the militia that will be there to meet them. We also see that, in a surprising twist of fate, that Bertha is sitting down with Mr. Gilbert and Mrs. Winterton, who is now promised that she and her husband will be making their way over to the Metropolitan, while bringing a few important names with her, including the Wilsons, the Marshalls, the Webbs, and many others. But unsurprisingly, this massively kind gesture comes with a price tag. Namely, the central box in the first tier of the Metropolitan, also known as Bertha's box. Oh, I hate to say it. Score 1 for Mrs. Winterton? Next, we see Bannister observing what appears to be an inebriated Church stumbling and making his way back to the Russell household. Sadly, as Bannister has not forgotten the action that Church took against him last season, it would appear that he is in the perfect position for revenge. Or as he says, justice. So for the last few episodes, we've seen that Jack has been working on a clock that would allow him to wake up on time, aka an alarm clock. And he is shocked and amazed and excited when said clock wakes him up at 6 o'clock on the dot. Everyone, with the exception of Armstrong, big surprise there, is very, very excited for him, as he has perfected this invention using an escape wheel that cannot be found anywhere else. Bannister feels that Jack should apply for a patent to protect his invention. Of course, there are rules and regulations in place, but it also costs a significant amount of money. $15 to apply and $20 more if the patent is granted. That translates to $456 to apply, plus $608 if the patent is granted, which altogether amounts to $1,064 in all. But with everyone's combined contributions, plus the additional donations from his employers, it appears that Jack is well on his way to becoming an established inventor. Over at the Russell household, we see Church and Mrs. Bruce interviewing potential new ladies' maids for Bertha. But their efforts come to naught, especially when one of the candidates seems significantly more interested in Church than the position itself. They are impressed and relieved with another candidate who is willing to assist Bertha on a trial basis so she can come to an informed decision. We then see Adelheid expressing her disappointment about her perceived emotion to Jack, while also informing him about Church's drunken antics, given that it is now the 30th anniversary of his wife's passing from smallpox when she was very young. When Jack passes this information along to the rest of the staff, Bannister realizes that he has made a grave error. That is because he has delivered a letter of his own to George Russell with untold consequences. We also witness his rather clumsy attempt to rectify this while making a request to church at the Russell household to remove said letter. His alibi, or white lie, is that he was writing to complain about the actions of Mrs. Russell in regard to the opera war, which has caused considerable anguish and frustration to his employer, Mrs. Van Ryn. Thankfully, church relents, and Bannister is able to tear up the letter before it can do any further harm. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for the letter that Jack receives from the patent office. It seems that his work cannot be considered as he does not belong to a horological society or institute. In this case, horological refers to clockmakers. Armstrong says that sanity has finally returned to 61st Street, and I was just thinking, so has bitterness and misery. Please, go away. Mrs. Bower wonders if there might be some way around this situation, and from the look on Bannister's face, it appears that some wheels might be turning. Next, we see Oscar visiting the Casterbridge Pacific Company to see Mr. Crowther about his personal investment. While he was able to get Oscar in, he mentions that now the investors are insisting that a premium be paid to buy out all the smaller stakeholders to reduce numbers. But of course, instead of doing the sensible thing and merely accepting the return on his investment, Oscar chooses to do the opposite and instead invest even more to become a principal stakeholder. All I know is playing around with other people's money never ends well, but if there's one thing I know about Oscar, he will never resist the urge to run headfirst into disaster. We see Peggy recounting her perilous experience in Tuskegee to Marian, who is rather shocked and horrified. She also imagines such an experience likely brought Mr. Fortune and Peggy much closer together. Oh, you don't know the half of it. But Peggy does eventually admit to the rather scandalous kiss that has taken place, although she says that Mr. Fortune kissed her, and to me it looked pretty mutual, but hey, I digress. Unfortunately, this new development is going to complicate a relationship that, up until now, has been very beneficial for Peggy. So one can only imagine what the outcome of that is going to be. Peggy's parents are equally horrified to hear about her experiences, but they are also very thankful for her safe return. Peggy also mentions that she'll be writing about her experiences for the Globe. Now, initially, this story was supposed to be about the school, but there's no way she can sit on the things that she's encountered. Peggy's mother also suggests that Peggy write about the education board attempting to shut down all the colored schools, including that of Miss Sarah Garnet's, who is the principal of the school where Mrs. Scott plays piano. And for those of you who are not familiar with Sarah Garnet's name, she was an American educator and suffragist who was an influential pioneer in the New York City public school system. She was also the founder of the Brooklyn Suffrage Organization for the Equal Suffrage League in the late 1880s, in addition to being the superintendent of suffrage for the National Association of Colored Women. Most significant was that she was the first Black woman to become a principal in the New York City school system and served as teacher and principal in active school service for 37 years. In the meantime, Peggy can show support by attending a meeting with her mother, where Sarah Garnet urges the attendees to sign a petition to stop the board. Naturally, Peggy's journalistic efforts would also be of great use in this matter. Peggy also informs Mr. Fortune about the expose she intends to write, and he is all for it, in addition to his desire to rally together the community. Naturally, we discover that Agnes is very excited about Marian's mashup with Dashiell, and not just because of the money and good name either. But she's also just as frustrated when she realizes that Marian intends to prioritize her teaching of poor and needy indigents rather than attend Dashiell's event. But eventually, we do see Marian attending the party that Dashiell has thrown to support the botanical gardens. This is, of course, after a Miss Frost urges her to attend and is willing to step in and continue teaching on her behalf. Naturally, Dashiell and Frances are very happy to see Marian once she arrives, and not even Agnes can hide her marginal excitement. When everyone gathers together for the unveiling of the Montgomery plaque for the gardens, everyone suddenly realizes that this plaque is far from the central attraction. That would actually be the proposal of Dashiell to Marian, as he realizes that in celebrating the contributions of his family, he also knows that his family is not yet complete. It's evident that Marian is not ready for this at all, but when she sees Frances's face, her choice is rather evident. She then agrees to marry him, but how this decision will likely weigh on her after this moment remains to be seen. How Larry appears to feel about this proposal also remains to be seen. We also see Ada, should I say Mrs. Forte, make her return from her honeymoon in Niagara Falls with her husband, and she is all too excited to inform her sister Agnes about her wonderful experience. An experience that clearly Agnes is still not all that comfortable with. So it's all the more shocking and frustrating when the Reverend discovers that his bad back problems belie a much deeper issue, a potentially fatal one as well: cancer. Damn! While Ada does what she can to support and comfort her husband, when she sees Agnes there for her, her grief and heartbreak is unmistakable. And finally, we see George having a meeting with Mr. Gilbert aboard his rather opulent private train. Since he is on his way to Pittsburgh to handle the matter of the strikes, he decides to cut to the chase. When it comes to the issue of Mrs. Winterton and the opera box, it turns out that Bertha will be keeping her box after all. George knows this is going to happen because it is his funding that has allowed the Metropolitan to resume its work and construction, with the caveat that his wife not be told about it. Which means that neither Bertha nor Mrs. Winterton will know about this switcheroo until opening night. And if somehow the issue cannot be resolved, then George will simply ask that the debt be repaid in full ASAP. We also see Mr. McAllister and the ever enigmatic Mrs. Astor, who now appears to be quite desperate. We see them both meeting with Agnes to discuss the opening of the Metropolitan, which now includes having the Duke of Buckingham as an honored guest. But if Mrs. Astor has anything to do with it, the Duke may be visiting the Academy instead. We then see George meeting Mr. Henderson at his home in a part of town that is clearly somewhat impoverished. Mr. Henderson is rather surprised at this chance meeting, but George is hoping to resolve everything if he possibly can. Unfortunately, when it comes to the issue of pay, George is unable to pay a different basic rate for common labor without it potentially disrupting steel production across the state and across all of America. One of you actually made this exact statement and spoke to this in your comments on one of my prior recaps. Now, there may be more to talk about when it comes to safety and even welfare, but as far as pay, the buck stops here. But Mr. Henderson is not budging, although he does know the stakes are extremely high. George then bids goodbye to Mrs. Henderson, who is sitting with her children, and thanks her for her hospitality. He also speaks to Mr. Henderson's son, who will be making his way to the mill in an hour. While George does not understand why Mr. Henderson would allow his son to work in a place that he claims is not fit for a horse, Ultimately, this fight is not only to provide his son with a better life, but also the sons of the entire town and working class. Over at the mill, we see that the strikers are now blocking the gates against the scabs, keeping them from entering. This then leads to an extremely heightened standoff between the strikers and the militia, which threatens to end in bloodshed, particularly when the militia prepares to fire upon the strikers. Mr. Clay suggests that George give the order, but in the end, George recognizes that he has no choice but to tell the troops to stand down. Mr. Clay is clearly disgusted and quickly departs. I do believe it was Mr. Clay who said that weakness was the harbinger of chaos. It is very, very clear that George is no heartless sociopath, nor a murderer. But it is also very clear that there will be unforeseen consequences for his last-minute capitulation. In other words, hello, chaos. And that closes out episode 6, Warning Shots. There's not much to say that I haven't already said, but I'm enjoying the series. I think it's doing a great job of building upon the foundation of season 1. And I'm enjoying just the different storylines and how things are progressing with all the characters. And, since I'm already behind, I'm going to go ahead and jump into the next recap. But I just want to go ahead and say that, yes, I am really enjoying what's happening here, and I'm excited to see what happens next. And as always, please feel free to drop down below and let me know your thoughts on my recap and the episode in general. So, once again, this is D, Movieman, signing off, and I'll see you with the movie.